Welcome to the ADHD Care podcast with your host, Archie. I have a special guest today, joining me today to discuss all things education, and I'm sure a lot of you out there are interested just to find out more about the education system, particularly when we think about young people that we obviously we try and support young people with special needs, including things like ADHD, autism and learning difficulty. I'm honoured to have our special guest today, Fintan O'Regan. So Fintan, he's an ex-head teacher, and so now he works with schools as a trainer and consultant, offering kind of support training to education staff on all things SEND. And I understand you also support parents, Fintan, just to work with young people that also have special educational needs.
Yes, I mean, thanks Archie first of all inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I worked predominantly with schools for a number of years now. I'm particularly interested in prevention of school exclusion, but also interested in obviously making sure that students reach their learning potential. And as a former teacher myself, I was happy to be able to help schools with some of the systems and strategies towards some of the non-traditional learners they've had. But during lockdown, of course, gave me an opportunity to also work with families, with students who were struggling at home during lockdown. And then also since then, I've been also continuing to help support children both in school and at home. They're only at school actually for 18% of the year. They're at home for 82% of the year. Some of that is sleeping. So there's a lot more time spent out of school than in school. So that's been an area I've been really enjoying also working with.
Mm-hmm. So if you could just maybe give us a bit of a background, what attracted you to this kind of field, particularly with working with...
Yeah, it's a good question actually. A lot of people sort of start off sort of finding themselves thinking that, some years later they'd be working so predominantly in a certain field such as this with ADHD and autism, as you said. Mm-hmm. And my journey was a little different from, I suppose, similar but different from most people who find themselves in this way, in that it wasn't conventional. So I was predominantly a secondary school science and PE teacher, and I taught initially in the northeast of England. I then saw an advert in the paper and I went to America and I taught an international school there, and I was late back one summer in order to try and get a job for the year coming up, and I saw this advertisement in a job for a small school in South London called Centre Academy, and what they wanted was a science and maths teacher. And when I went to the interview, I said to the person, I've never really taught maths before, and he said, you'll be okay here. And because it really wasn't about teaching subjects, it was about meeting young people who had special needs, who were different. And that was my start of my journey. It was a slightly unusual school. It was called, it was in Clapham, or now it's called Clam, as you know, and it had students from the international community, predominantly from the American international community, who had SEN. And back in the late 80s, 90s, ADHD wasn't seen in the UK in the way it is now. So it was kind of an American element to it that first got me involved in this particular area. I was only going to stay for one term, and I stayed for 14 years, and I was a head teacher for 6 of those years.
Wow, what a journey. So we have quite a bit of an agenda, and some of you have been putting forward some questions for me to put to Fintan today. So we might as well just go straight into it.
Go ahead.
I think one of the subjects you mentioned there was about school exclusions, and this is something that I see, particularly in my work, working with children and schools as well, with young people with ADHD and autism. The rate of exclusion particularly is very high in this population of young people. What is your take around that whole exclusion?
I could speak for hours on this. A lot of it starts off with a complete change of policy really over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, and it's generated by there's a new sort of broom in town about the Every Child Matters approach, where we were very inclusive and stuff. That ship has sailed, and it's been quoted by someone who is the behaviour czar, who is very much advising the government on policy that the few should not affect the rights of the many. So it's been very much about we shouldn't allow any disruptive students or students who are difficult get in the way, and that's been a general philosophy. Now, not every school, not every authority, of course, is adopting that approach, but that unfortunately has been the actual philosophy literally, and some people have been taking it quite literally. So much so that exclusion has gone up in the last 5 years. This is before, and during lockdown, the figures are slightly going to be different, by 45% in terms of fixed term exclusions and 35% in terms of permanent exclusions. And you've got a problem when you have an acronym for exclusion. So as opposed to calling it fixed term, we were calling it FEXes, and we're calling it permanent, we're calling it PEXes. And when some people start using acronyms for stuff that's been used too much, there's a real problem.
Yeah.
And then I think, just to sort of finish that, when you really drill down to what is the main reason for permanent exclusion, it is not drugs, it is not violence, it is not assaults on those are factors that can contribute to permanent exclusions, but something called persistent disruptive behaviour. And it just coincidentally happens to be the main reason for fixed term exclusions. And that therefore builds into permanent, because you have to have 45 days of fixed term exclusions before you get permanently excluded. So it's persistent disruptive behaviour is the core issue of both fixed and therefore permanent exclusions. When you drill down to what that term means, it's a really catch-all term, and it doesn't mean that all the students that have that are related to this PDB have ADHD or ASC. But honestly, Archie, when you look at the characteristics that we're looking at, then a lot of them do seem to have, there is an overlap. And what I can tell you is this, from a head teacher and from an advisor and from a consultant: if the second fixed term exclusion doesn't change the philosophy in terms of what the family and the child and the school are going to do, the 6th, 7th, 9th and 10th are not going to change it. And it's just this, that's the frustration that once something is happening, we're alerted to it, we keep on using the same blunt instrument to deal with the issue. And that's really what gets me up in the morning and really drives me to sort of try and see about seeking change.
I see it as how these schools, not all, obviously, we don't want to sort of bash all the schools and say they're all the same. Some schools are, I feel they are well inclusive and they try their best to accommodate young people. But what I tend to see is how the education system in general sometimes doesn't seem to fit, particularly with the young people that we see with SEND and autism and ADHD. So we're trying to get them to fit into this kind of generalised kind of way of how so treat everyone the same, essentially. So rather than trying to adapt to their needs and accommodate and have adaptations in the environment. Yeah,
and it doesn't have, we're obviously, let's face it, we are both interested in certain areas. I'm interested, not so much in terms of in traits, but that point you're making is very true, that there's a misunderstanding that just because you're at the same age, you're not at the same stage. And as you know, I've been trying to look at this, trying to change the D's in ADHD from deficit disorder to developmental difference, because I find that in my training with schools, once they understand that he or she is not at the same stage as his age, that he might be a 15-year-old, but he's got impulse control and concentration skills as a 12-year-old, and maybe creativity as an 18-year-old. It's a developmental difference. It's not a deficit disorder. Once that penny drops, they stop comparing what they do to their peers. So that's a very crucial area to try and get across. Now, it doesn't mean that people can get away with things. There's still got to be some things that are in terms of health and safety, and in terms of, there's got to be some non-negotiables for everybody. But we do need some flexibility for people who are not at the same stage as their age. And that's really the quest. And to be fair, as you said, a lot of schools have been adapting. I think the issue of there's so many pressures on schools, and that is very, obviously people will know that, but a little bit of training, a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of understanding about why people do things and what's the message behind it can dramatically reduce the impact of what we're seeing in terms of exclusions. And that's been happening in many schools that have been adapting and want to know different ways of dealing with things.
And I know part of your training that you do in consultancy work, you talk a lot about behaviour and the message behind a behaviour, rather than seeing it as a personal attack to you as the teacher. And you talk about remember you mentioned something about BDS?
yeah. It's an old long story, that, but it's basically, I mean, the message, behaviour is a message. A lot of people understand that, and what's the reason for why someone pushes back and doesn't appear to want to do what everyone else seems to do. And I went to a course once, and the guy was saying that it was about BDS, and he said it was called bad day syndrome, and that itself wasn't very helpful. But what it did was it helped me sort of analyse really what we're talking about when we want to change behaviour, and I decided that instead of talking about behaviour, I was going to be talking about changing mood and mood and motivation. And so I've been working with the M's, if you like, as opposed to behaviour. So for me, it's not about changing behaviour. It's de-escalating situations that lead to a better mood, and you get a better mood, you get a better result, you get a better outcome. So I don't talk about behaviour management. I talk about management of mood.
And just obviously being an ex-teacher yourself, in terms of the actual training that teachers have, does that include what you're talking about?
No, I'm afraid it doesn't. And and you would think the obvious thing would be that in teacher training that there would be a lot of information given, because we are an inclusive sort of school system. The whole special school, mainstream school was very much reorientated some years ago, and there's so many pressures on that time in order to prepare lessons and in order to be able to sort of analyse other aspects of education. But SEN training, I'm afraid, for new teachers in particular, is very minimal indeed, and it doesn't necessarily mean that that what's being given now isn't very good. There's just not a lot of it. I mean, I saw a book the other day which was an A to Z of SEN, and there's about 9 terms, Archie, under A. I haven't got to the B's yet. Wow. So there is an awful lot to take on board. But I think if we were to take on board some of the key terms and traits, autism, ADHD, dyslexia, some of the other elements of that of learning difficulties, maybe some aspects of what we call oppositional defiant disorder, maybe the term itself, but in terms of de-escalating some of the non-traditional learners. And I think what we are moving into, fortunately, is an area of not wanting to know more about neurodivergence. I think that's happening not just in schools, it's happening as a society. So I think that will translate at some point through, the educational system. So I think everyone will benefit from that.
And any message you might want to give to newly qualified teachers?
Well, I think first of all, don't give up. Never give up. And some of you will do things hopefully differently from some of the people who it's your turn. I find that newly qualified teachers are very hungry, obviously, because they want to learn. They want to sort of do things. I suppose I would say to them is not to sort of try and learn everything at once, but basically, just try and play what's in front of you. And if someone is doing something differently, try and inquire what that means. And is it because they can't learn? Is it because they won't learn? And I think there's a slight difference in that rhythm. And often it is about because they can't read and they're at secondary and therefore they act out. So, you said before, behaviour is a message. So I think it's also about not just reading everything on the internet and believing it all as well. I think I would definitely say to new teachers to basically look at a colleague, a slightly more experienced colleague, someone that you rate in terms of how they deal with people. Because in the end of the day, you can call it ADHD, ODD, BBC, MTV. It's about dealing with people, and it's about people's skills. And I think if you see someone who's got a way of de-escalating things or developing rapport and trust in someone, then I think they'll be a good role model for you to consider, as opposed to going online, which is never a bad thing. But I would look at individuals within your own community and learn from them.
What I usually often hear from schools is they feel that there need to be a diagnosis to be able to make a change or an adaptation, or to implement a strategy to support that young person. And yeah, we say even if there is a diagnosis, the strategy is going to be still the same in terms of what we'll be recommending.
Yeah, I mean it's one of those anomalies. You're absolutely right, and then you don't need a diagnosis to allow someone to fiddle in your class, or to not look at you when you're speaking, or to doodle when you're doing that, or to offer them a movement break, or to make sure that you've basically broken things down. You don't, or a visual timetable. Yes, it does drive me to distraction that you need a diagnosis to do that. I think in some cases, you should play what's in front of you, and I think, but sometimes people need a reason for doing something different, and that is a bit puzzling. But as I say, you don't need to wait for and a diagnosis, as most people know, is only the start of the journey anyway. As you've rightly said, there's some of those techniques that we just talked about, or strategies, are there why you could do them before. So yes, there's a little bit of we need to sort of like promote that a little bit more, that you don't need a diagnosis in order to make some changes. And as we know, getting a diagnosis and assessment can be quite a long time, and while that's happening, the clock is ticking. The child is still going to school and having to sort of deal with some of the differences and challenges of how they learn.
And just to point out that you work with independent and I think I work. It is interesting that I think predominantly we used to think ADHD very much as a behavioural issue, and because of that, I seem to be asked to go to many schools which were to do with behaviour issues. But it's very much a learning issue too, and a socialisation issue. It is very much about getting on with other peers as well as getting on with the curriculum. And I think what's happened is the independent schools for many years, I think what happened was when they had students who had a different learning difference, I think dyslexia seemed to be the term that everyone was referring to. And for many kids, that was probably one of the reasons. But I think they've realised now that the independent schools, that dyslexia is not the only reason why children are different. And so in the last 5 or 6 years, I've been invited to many more independent schools in terms of helping them understand some of the learning differences of students they have. And there are issues of behaviour, but also you've got to remember what we're also looking at, not just in both independent and in state, is learning potential. It's loss of learning potential. We're not, children aren't achieving what they could do. I mean, I always use this analogy about. It happened actually in a recent independent school where this teacher said that this student is like a computer without the printer attached. He's got the information in his head, but he can't give me the hard copy. And you don't judge kids on what they know, you judge them on what they tell you they know. And she said, my job is to try and find out how to get that hard copy. And I thought that was a brilliant, analogy about what we're trying to do. So she knew he was different, but she didn't know why. And then we went in and started talking about some of the differences in terms of processing and some of the differences in impulse and concentration that are related to ADHD. The pennies dropped, and once developmental differences was understood, we really were able to fly. Did you ever come across the whole bias or stigma around things like autism and ADHD, where that can then affect that particular teacher in terms of how they might view that young person, whether they might not believe necessarily in those type of conditions, whereby when they look at the behaviour, they put it down to the young person's making a choice rather than it being really struggling with this.
I would describe this to you in saying, when I do my training, I would say there's generally, say you're taking a typical secondary school, you've got 3 types of teacher. You've got those that get the quirky kids. They don't really need a label, they just play what's in front of them. You've got those who are kind of at the middle third, who are very much in the state that they're still a bit worried that he or she is pulling the wool over your eyes and he or she is getting away with it. It's a couple of things you've got to do there. They have to have a better understanding of the term and what developmental difference means, and then you need to also show that I use this band 1, band 2 criteria, where band 1 is for everyone with your ADHD, ODD, BBC, NTV. There's some things that are non-negotiable. And then I have a band too, where like things like calling out in class and not having your PE kits and not having a pen aren't crimes against humanity. That gets that middle band, because then they feel secure that everyone is going to be getting the same sort of treatment on some things, but then you can be more flexible with others, because we give people glasses to read, we give people inhalers to breathe. So therefore you get them. Then you've got the last third who are they're the sort of toughest ones, because they do think that there's it's all about an excuse. You got to explain the science to them. And actually, interestingly, I've a bit of a lot of them are a slightly of a teacher's sense. They've got a sort of a slightly Asperger-y sort of framework. So, but they like the science, and once they understand the science, then the arms become unfolded, and then you've got them as well. So that's my strategy. You go in for the 3/3, and you're not going to get everybody who's going to agree with you. I think the only other thing to say on this is that sometimes people don't like labels, and I think we have to accept the fact that that's going to be their choice. So I do talk a lot more about traits than labels. And in a way, it's not a bad way of doing it, because, as you know well, overlap with other terms or conditions is the norm and not the exception. So whereas the terms are relatively new, the traits have always been around and will always be around, and therefore they need support.
And just moving on slightly there, I just wanted to touch on, because we are in exam season right now. We've had a lot of disruption over the last couple of years with COVID and lockdowns and homeschooling, and things are starting to go back to some sort of normality. And I'm just thinking of those young people that are currently sitting the exams or preparing to start the exams, and then obviously bearing in mind the ones that have autism, ADHD. What advice would you have? Let's start with the young people first.
I think the young people first. I think the most important thing is not to sweat it. Is not panicking. I think I don't know an awful lot about how it's going to be graded this year, but I imagine there is going to be that input or the aspect of being of being aware of the fact that these young people have not had examinations sat at for many years, and they haven't got the experience of doing that. So I'm not saying they're going to be kinder with them, but there's obviously going to be a curve to take this into consideration. I mean, I think there is some anxiety. It's interesting, when I talk about ASC, particularly autistic spectrum, I always say you've got to do three things. Number one is reduce the anxiety. Number two is reduce the anxiety. And guess what number three is? It's reduce the anxiety. So, and if I go back to also what I said about mood, I think it's very much going to be down to, the schools to actually really help to understand that anxiety. Obviously staffing is difficult, but we do know there are a number of options in terms of offering alternative ways of sitting the exam, whether it's sitting in a room by yourself, whether it's typing it, whether it's having someone being a scribe, whether it's using technology. I think the challenge is that needs a lot of staffing in order to do that. But obviously what we want to know is what's in that. We want to know we want to get the printout from the computer. So I think that's what we do. I think for parents as well, at home, I think I would say it really is tea and toast time, and not nagging them to revise and things like that. I think it is about just making sure we understand that this is real for them, this anxiety, and you can't just work harder because you're told to. And not to say that we don't provide the structure, we don't provide the advice, or but can I tell you, I think we should be nudging them, not nagging them. And also within the school system, I think obviously what we do need to do is to make sure that that maybe we know that, I was going to make this point, some students really do need more structure than others, in so much as whether there is free time in between their exams, should they be revising at home or should they be in school? Well, I would say that generally speaking, more structure is better than less structure. So my view would be that probably revision is probably, if it's those gaps in the schedule because of the dates and the exams, not necessarily to have them revise at home, but to have them revise in school.
Which absolutely makes sense. You touched on parents there, and I know you support parents as well. And I come across lots of parents, particularly during this exam period, that are literally like stressing, and they feel the child is not prepared enough. They haven't revised, or they're rushing to the last minute. We know most young people, they tend to leave things to the last minute.
Boys in particular. I wouldn't say that all girls are all going to be planning in advance, but I've been a parent of. I've got twin boys and I've got a daughter. They've all been through the system, and my daughter, I think, was revising more. Generally, and I think part of the reason because most of her friends were, whereas the boys are a bit more last minute. And I think that's not to say all boys will be like that and all girls will be like that. But I think, as I said before, I think for parents, I think, if we pick on the fact that I'm always talking about mood, and I always make the analogy that, if you're in a plane and you have twin 1 on one side on the left and twin 2 on the other side on the right, and the oxygen mask came down, who the pilot says it goes on first? And the answer, by the way, is not your favourite child, it's you, because when you're breathing properly, you sort them out. It's the same sort of thing at home now. You set the climate as the parent, you set the tone, and I think your mood, your positive mood, your creative, but also your calmness and these sort of things, and not hyperventilating, so to speak, will actually, to follow that through, is going to be the crucial thing. You set the climate. So, I always say there's 3 aspects. Number 1 is your mood, the mood of the adult. Number 2 sometimes is the mood of the others. It might be the siblings that you need to work on to maybe stop annoying them and teasing them or whatever. And then once you get those 2, then you do affect the mood of the third child, which is usually the one that you've been mostly concerned about.
That saying what you just described there, I'm sure you described something similar with schools, whereby you're trying to tackle the one who's kind of egging the other one's on. It happens all the time. I always say it's 3. You got the 3. Number 1 is this adult. Number 2 are the players, and number 3, because you have and part of the reason for that. So I go to a class to watch Tom. The people I come back reporting on are usually Lucy and Taylor, who are winding up Tom. And Tom, when he's wound up, because he's got poor impulse control, he's the one that flies. So the ones you need to go out for, obviously the teachers situation, how they control themselves and how they control things is the crucial one, but they need to go for those other kids. Those other kids are more premeditated, they know what they're doing and do it anyway, and they play the one that you usually catch. And part of the reason for that is because they're a little bit bored, those other students. And I talk a lot about boredom in school, or reducing boredom in school, and it isn't just for the child with ADHD or ASC, it's for the players, because when they're bored, what they do is they look for stimulation and usually get it from those other individuals. So you're absolutely right. I know, again, some of the things that have been raised by parents is around choosing the right school for your child, be it moving to secondary school, primary school, and that's a tough one, really. I find that's something that I always get people emailing.
I mean,
what is how would you define the right school for your child?
It is very difficult, and I get the same question too. I mean, there are some organisations that are there. I think the key thing, I honestly think, for a parent going to a school is you need to meet the head or the representatives of the senior leadership team, and you need to be honest with them about what is their philosophy, what is their attitude towards your child's reaction to this A, B, or C. I mean, there are some schools out there that you will be aware of who will be more flexible than others, and there are some organisations. There's one organisation called Crested, for example, which is a council of schools that are registered for the teaching of dyslexia. Now they have a number of levels in there, but those schools will be, to a certain extent, neurodiverse friendly, because they've gone into that sort of like organisation to be involved with that. But I think the number one thing, when I was a head teacher of my school, the parents that came in and they were looking at other schools, when they came back, I said, why did you choose our school? And they said it was because, not trying to be pompous, because of me. They felt comfortable with me looking after their child. I suppose the only thing I would say is that, sort of putting this out, is that you should never think that that you deserve the school. You should think, to a certain extent, as a parent, does the school deserve to have my child? And if they don't, then that's not the right school for you. But I think you have to go and visit them. I think I would be upfront and honest about some of the things that you feel might occur in situations. It's not so much that they're ADHD or ASD friendly, but what would they do if this happens in this situation, and how flexible can they be in terms of what is likely to happen? Because I think sometimes parents think by change is somehow it's all going to fall off and go away. I think the jump from primary to secondary is the biggest jump that kids ever make, because you go from a one teacher, one classroom to 9 teachers, 9 different attitudes and styles, and it's a big jump. So I think I would be pretty upfront about what you think could happen and what would happen as a result of that, so you don't get a surprise in October once you've moved schools.
And that crucial period as well that you're talking about, moving from primary to secondary, is really important as well. Like I've done lots of work around transitioning and preparation for transitioning. What parents are just be worth bearing in mind in terms of liaising with the new school, and what you're saying, they're talking with the head of SEN, and just to be mindful of that, because that's something that's going to come in the next academic year. So parents, there is. Have you done any? Because obviously you've got lots of publications that you put up. We've got to mention that you've written lots of books, and for. Was it mainly for schools, teachers, parents as well? The recent one is more parent and schools. It's called How to Help with Attention Deficit Disorder and ADHD, or attention difficulties and ADHD. So it's more both child and parents. But most of the books, I have to say, have been written mostly for schools. And we do mention transition in there. So there are some tips. I think the most important thing, like I say though, is I think you need to visit the school, and just because the school says it does something, you just need to understand, it doesn't necessarily mean they do. So you do need to use your instincts. Always a good idea to maybe, if you're involved with a support group, to talk to other parents who would know what's happened in year 8 and 9. If you're going into year 7 sort of situation, I think it's always good to do that. I think there's no golden rules on transition, other than the fact that the more information that, and for certain students with ASC in particular, the more time they can spend at the new school prior to going there. So you've reduced the anxiety, so they know a little bit what to expect in terms of the geography of the school, in terms of where the loos are and those sort of things. As they really, those individuals like to know what they know, and they don't like uncertainty. So I think as much as that is a time, and it's a time in terms of investment, I think it's a time worth spending in that area. But I go back to my main point that it's very hard to sort of, some parents will say, it doesn't do this, it doesn't do that. But also look at what it does do. You will not get the school that's going to fit your hand like a glove. It's not going to cover every finger, every tip, every aspect. But you want a school that obviously fits the majority of that hand, or the glove that fits the majority of the hand. I'm not sure if that metaphor's working, but you get the idea, So the other thing I was going to touch on was just around, I know we've been focusing a lot on behaviour, but certainly when it comes to ADHD autism, it's not just purely behaviour. There is other young people that are struggling with emotions, socially interacting with others, or just with the concentration. So the daydreamers, the ones that tend not to get picked up.
Yeah, it's what I do. There's two things you said there that are really important. Number one is that we always talk about the overt ones, but there's always very much the covert ones. And for many years, we know that inattentiveness, particularly with boys and particularly with girls, was not picked up in primary. We also know that girls, to a certain extent, have masked a lot of symptoms in ASC as well. But there are also boys who've masked some things as well. And there are also boys who have inattentive ADD as well. So we do need to be more aware about that. But I think, and the other thing that you were talking about though is getting the other kids involved. I use an approach I call SF3R when it comes to management, and it's S is for structure, F is flexibility, which complements structure. And the 3 R's are rapport, relationships, and resilience. Now, the relationships one, everyone assumes is the adult and the child. It's very much is about the child and the child. What we've really got to do in all schools is to really get across the idea of neurodivergence, not just to the staff, but to the other pupils. And the interesting thing is that when it comes to diversity, because they need to know why someone in their class is different. They know they're different, they don't know why. They look the same, but they don't react the same way. And then also, if you're going to treat them slightly differently, you're going to be more flexible with them, they're not going to buy into that until they can see why he or she is not. And so I'm really advocating that all schools will do assemblies for every year group at a different pitch, different level on neurodiversity and neurodivergence, because you want to prevent bullying, because children with SEN are 3 times more likely to be bullied because they stand out and different, other kids who are bullied for other reasons. And it's an easy one to sell because they're already into diversity. They're into diversity in gender, they're into diversity in race, they're better sometimes in this area. So diversity they are much more open to that. But the one that's missing right now is the idea of neurodiversity. And you can, once you get that in, I've done quite a few assemblies on that, they lap it up because they've already got diversity, bit of brain, then you're on your way. And that will reduce aspects of bullying, because what you want in any bullying situation, you've got a victim, which is often a child with SEN, although sometimes they are what's called a provocative victim. You have the bully or the bullying behaviour, and you always have bystanders involved. And the bystanders aren't getting involved in that because they're not quite sure where they should go. But what you want your bystanders to be are upstanders. So, and you get them upstanding in issues of race now and in gender, because they say that's just not right. We're not doing, that's just wrong. But what we want to do is the same thing when it comes to neurodiversity, and that's the plan.
Yeah, and I think it goes way away from the school. I think in society in general, things like that. I think the message it's still lacking, and we talk about even with mental health. Now, particularly with the lockdown, there's been more openness around good to talk and all these campaigns and stuff. It's
okay not to be okay, and I think that we are shifting things and things are better. I suppose the issue is, and things are better, the issue that the difference is though is we've created to a certain extent a greater awareness, and we've created the demand for supporting that, and that's where we got a bit of bottleneck right now, because we just don't seem to have the resources to do that. But overall, you're right, there's a lot more understanding, and the issue isn't just about schools, of course, it's the workplace. And I think that's the other frontier that we need to sort of be exploring, and I think that is starting to happen, neurodiversity in the workplace, but there's a long way to go in that particular area, and as you say, in society in general.
Yeah, what I'm noticing as well with young people, they are talking more around neurodiversity. There's more that's been put out on social media platforms. We have some parents coming in with their young people for an assessment, and the young person was the one who was actually pushing for the assessment because they saw a clip on TikTok that mentioned about ADHD.
Absolutely, and I think what I've seen is that medium has definitely generated a lot more understanding, and they're not seeing it as a problem; they're seeing it as an explanation, which is what it is. And also, there's 2 aspects of that, isn't there? I think there's been a lot more girls, I think, that have now started to sort of be talking about ADHD than there was maybe 2 years ago. But the other interesting aspect, though, is not just the children talking about it and wanting to get to know what's real difficult with them. They're also driving the sort of the parents to also question why they were different as a child. So we're seeing many more parents having gone through that journey without knowing why they were different, because of going through the journey with their child, now understanding that they have these traits, and therefore they're getting assessed, and therefore they're getting some understanding and treatment of how they learn and how they might react differently.
You must come across that a lot through your work with the parents, where, because I see it as well in my work as well, where for the parent to have that penny dropping moment where they start to realise, what, I might have. Also, I've gone through what you've gone through.
It happens a lot. It happens a lot. And actually, just to take that to another area, I always say, because we do know that it's a very genetic issue. It's not in every family, but I would say that for teachers, and particularly who are listening to this, or people in education, I always make this point: if you're working with a child with ADHD, you're often working with a family with ADHD. So some of the expectations you may have on the parents in terms of supporting that child during examinations, during sort of like organising their PE kit and things like that, might need to be somewhat revised, because those parents, not that to say that all parents will have ADHD or ASC, but a lot of them may, and therefore you're working with a family. So you need to be, if your sanctions are there because he or she hasn't got a PE kit with them, or they didn't bring their pen, this might be a child coming from a home where that is very difficult, coming in on time with most of his materials and his uniform on, and what that might be pretty much what you're going to get. Not having a pen is not a crime against humanity.
Yeah. One thing I want to touch on, I'm sure we've still got a few more, we've got time, the H word, homework.
Yeah. Well, I thought I didn't know what H word you were going to come up with then. Okay, so I'm a big fan of taking the burden of homework off the parents. There's a very established statistic to say it takes a child with ADHD 3 times as long to do the same piece of work at home as in school. So reducing homework within that kind of framework should be done, or having it done in school, or maybe not even having it at all, because this issue about homework reinforcing work in school is true to an extent, but if it's causing so many problems when the child comes in without it next day, and then there's an argument, then I think you're sort of like you're cutting off your nose to spite your face, so to speak. I mean, I always tell this story. It's a true story about a child who I had years ago with ADHD, and he came in one day. He was always losing things and stuff. He came in one day with a white sock, as in a sock and he said to me, "Sir," he said, "my mum said to give this to you." And I said, "Well, what is it?" First of all, he said, "Sir, it's not my sir, it's my brother's." That was important to him. And on the sock there was a little yellow post-it note. There's another story with those, by the way. But anyway, I looked at the post-it note and it said, "Mr. O'Regan, I'm spending 3.5 hours trying to get Jason to finish his science homework. Please find his laundry enclosed." And it was a brilliant note. And the mother was saying to me, "Help me." Yeah. This was a piece of homework, should have taken 20 minutes. But, when he came home from school, getting him to do it was difficult. And if we take the issue that going to school is like swimming, say 20 lengths of a swimming pool. If you have ADHD, getting through school and trying to do things in the same way that other people, when you're not the same, it's like 20 lengths in treacle. You will be exhausted by the time you get to the afternoon. So the evening is a bridge too far. Yeah. So it is taking the burden of homework off the parents. Absolutely.
And how can schools do that?
Well, as I said early on, I would either have homework clubs after school where the child gets most of it done before they go home, maybe at break or lunch, or reducing it to the point where it takes us 3 times as long to do at home as in school. Yeah. So, I mean, the interesting thing about homework is, as being a head teacher, I can tell you who really likes homework. That is the parents. But you either give too much or you give too little. Yeah. It's something that I think parents want to see. Some parents don't want to see, but what the idea is that expecting a child who's got a neurodivergent difference to do the same work as everyone else at home is just not going to happen. And as I said, you can reduce it, you can adapt it, you can have it done at different times, but it's better to get whatever needs to be done, majority of it, during the school day, as opposed to sending them home and expecting the parents to try and cajole and use all their other methods to sort of try and get a child who's really pretty tired now from having to try to fit in all day when it's harder for them to do it anyway.
And I think it's trying to understand the young person what the purpose of doing homework is.
Yeah. I mean, there's another. We could have a whole big thing on homework. It's if it's more of the same. I mean, project homework is useful. And I think reinforcement. Online, and there are obviously programs that are. I think you do tend to find that computer-based type activities do tend to attract individuals who have these types of learning traits. So I think it is very much it's not just the type of homework, is it? It's not the quantity or whatever, it's the quality of what they get. But I would say to you that, I mean, there was some years ago in France, there was this I think the policy was they didn't give anyone any homework, because the idea was that only the students that had the homes where the parents were kind of on it, so to speak, would actually give the students the support. So the child was being disadvantaged. Now, I don't think that's going to happen over here, but the philosophy behind it was the fact that it wasn't equal, so to speak. So I think we're not going to get into that sort of territory, I wouldn't have thought, over here. But I do think there is a sense of us looking at homework in terms of that, in terms that it's not going to be the same. But I think if you get the idea that you're not working just with a child, you're working with a family, I think that message will then help schools to understand they need to be more creative, if you like, with supporting homework and not just giving everyone the same when they leave the school day.
Yeah, I think for most of us parents, we went through the homeschooling as well, whereby we had to become teachers, and we could appreciate, how difficult that was.
I think you're right. During COVID, I think you probably did feel that teachers probably were worth their weight in gold. But it's like everything else. It was an opportunity, and certain people, I think, liked being at home. If you had the idea of not having the pressures of having to sort of conform to all of the things that you might find difficult, having to work in large groups which you might find difficult because they were noisy, or they made you or basically you couldn't concentrate because of people. There were some advantages from that. I was at a school the other day where in a primary school, they've rearranged the desks all facing sort of the same direction, which they do in secondary schools, and they found that to be much more beneficial for a child, for example, who had ADHD, who was sitting around a table with 4 or 5 other people, where he couldn't filter out all the other kids who were there. So there's been some things that have come out of COVID, I think, that have been useful.
You saying that, it just made me start to think that what have we all learned, not just school teachers and stuff, in terms of coming out of COVID, in terms of ourselves. We've had to adapt how we work, work environment, the style of work, working from home and all of that. And I'm just thinking about schools as well. Have they, is there anything that they've adapted post-COVID that they've got? Well,
I think they have. I think they have arranged, some of the seating arrangements have been, years ago when I was talking about seating arrangements, I was talking about students at Central Academy who had single seats and chairs. It wasn't like an examination room, because they weren't beside someone, they was less likely to be distracted by someone, and they wouldn't do that all the time. If they were doing group work, you'd put things together. But I think some of the things they have done in terms of using, in terms of social distancing, have actually benefited some students who have, some of the traits we're talking about today. I think there's been some disadvantages in that as well. I think, teachers, in my view, need to work the room more. They don't just need to stand the front, because they need to know what's going on at the back. So I think, there's been a lot of people I've seen who've been a lot less mobile than they used to be. And I think you need to be, I use an analogy of teachers need to be a mobile meerkat. They've got to be working the room. You've got to be watching. You've got to be seeing what is going on. And so I think there's been some disadvantages. But also, I think the use of technology, in a way, I think we've benefited from seeing that some people, like that medium. But I don't think there's any. I don't think there's any. I don't think that. I think live interaction is still, best. But I think a mix and match of that sort of thing for some individuals, maybe in the afternoon, if they dug in all morning, in the afternoon to do something more on a technological sense in the afternoon. It's not to say they should do, but if the afternoon is a bridge too far and you're having more difficulties in terms of their reactions to things, then maybe why not, use it in that sort of way, be more flexible.
Mm-hmm. There's 2 more things I'm going to touch on. First one is about going back to behaviour. We used to have EBD schools. I'm not sure if they're still there or they're being passed to something else. And also I wanted to also touch on EHCPs, Education Healthcare Funds.
Yeah.
So whichever one you want to tackle
first. Well, I think the term EBD has been supplied. There are schools that they're SEMH now. It's social, emotional, mental health. It's the same term. It's gone through different channels. Yeah. So there are schools. There are schools for SEMH. I think, and I would say in some cases, that might be in a more appropriate environment than a mainstream school, depending on the mainstream school. The thing about an SEMHC school, yes, there is some risks in that, because you will get students who will all have a number of traits, and then grouping them together can be, a risk, if you like, than have a few in a mainstream school. But the staff all want to work there. They all want to work with students who have those sort of like issues. So because of that, you can get a much better relationship with staff who all want to work with students who are different. A lot of it depends, again, on the structures and the rigours and, the aspects and the aspirations of that school. So I think they are, it's an option. Alternative provision is an option. Mainstream school does not fit everybody, particularly if you've only got a third of teachers, like I mentioned earlier, you've got 2/3 aren't in it, then there's going to be a problem. So I think it's so alternative provision is for me, I think, something you shouldn't leave off the table if the mainstream school isn't working. The issue of EHCPs, I'm not, in terms of, I don't. Do you mean in terms of how to get one? How difficult it is to get one?
So usually something. I get people wanting to find out more about the process of getting one, and sometimes they might think if you get a diagnosis of ADHD alone, it will automatically mean that you'll be entitled to...
No, it certainly doesn't. It certainly doesn't. And I think it is something that I think is a shock to parents. I think, they do battle to get through the process sometimes, because they're going through, agencies to get an ADHD assessment. No, I'm afraid it doesn't guarantee that. It's about level of need, and it's about, and I think, it is a process that it can be quite arduous for some people. So, I'm afraid, and sometimes you will, many parents have really found the struggle really quite dispiriting. But the issue is that it doesn't mean if you do feel that the school is not meeting the needs of your child, and you can justify that by whatever means and documentation and observation that you've gone through, then, the legal right is for the child, the school, or the authority to meet your needs. Now, they're not necessarily not going to agree with that, but the process of going through it can get sticky. But also, disability law is there to help children who have difficulties. So, you can go legal. There is a battle. I've been to so many tribunals over the years with parents and authorities, and invariably, once we get to that point, the authority gives in. But getting one, the demand is very high, and as we know, money and resources are short. So, but it is about, I think it's about being two words really. It's about being tenacious, and also in your dealings with people, keeping your eye on the prize, and as frustrated as you might be, you can't be over emotional about it. You've got to be, keeping, steady eddies on it, really, so to speak, and that will, and if you feel that, as I said before, it does happen, but it is a battle.
Before, I don't know if they're still there, but there used to be advocacy services like parent partnership. I'm sure they've been called something else, which is support services whereby they can act on behalf of parents, or just I'm sure there were ex-teachers. You probably know a lot of that.
Well, yes, and I mean you probably there's lots of different operations and organisations like that, and some of them might have been ex-teachers, some of them were parents who'd gone through the process themselves. I know there used to be one operation called Befrienders, and they were like parents who'd gone through the situation themselves and then were providing advice for other people. I think the best thing I would say is that it is always a good idea to join your local support group, or to find out who they are, either they're live or online, because they will know what's available. And they will you'll learn from other parents about what services, what options are available. So I think that's always a good place to start. I don't think the local authority is going to recommend you anybody, but you know what I mean. There's somebody in the school might, and the Senko is obviously a good place to start. But I think I think joining a support group is a good idea anyway, because you end up finding you're not alone. You aren't sort of like an island, so to speak. Other people are going through the same things that you are, but you do end up finding out a lot about other sources of sources and resources.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. We covered a lot of topics there. I just wanted to just finish off and just find out what, just maybe if you can give our listeners out there just information about where they can find out more about the services and any publications that you put out there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't come here on these things to sell anything, but I will. But I am. If you are interested, I have a website which is www.fintanoregan.com. It's FINTAN, and then O'Regan, OREGAN.com. Pretty easy to find because there aren't many people called Fintan out there, really. And I've written a number of books which are, like I said, they are mostly for teachers. I suppose the new one I have, which is called How to Help, is more for teachers and for parents. But also, if you do contact me, I will get back to you at some point. My email is fjmoregan1@gmail.com. And if there's things that I can't support you with because I don't have the skill set that you're looking for, or the time, sometimes I've got to be honest, I will pass you on to other people. But I think the most important thing is, I would say this for any parent particularly listening right now, number one thing is you need to understand how your child sees the world. I think if you can do that, and by whichever means possible, whether it's by reading or by talking to other parents about it, it will make their behavior or reactions clearer to you, and therefore you will be able to better support how they can react to it. Talking of which, I have got 101 top tips, which seems to be popular. If you want that just as pointers, because often, if I'm honest with you, a lot of what we do in training and any of these things, resources we have, is probably confirming some things, but usually it will spark some things too, and I think that's what you want, because your child is unique. He or she will have a different way of how they react to certain things. You will know them best. But, sometimes things can spark you, some ideas can spark you to adapt them to fit your child's needs.
Yeah, I think, that's a very good point to end on, actually. And it's not all about the negatives and the challenges. There is also positives in there. Your child's unique qualities, their strengths.
Yeah.
And using that, particularly with ADHD, we tend to see that a lot, where, if they get channeled in the right direction, they can thrive.
It's the irony of ironies. Like that's why I call it developmental differences. And schools in particular, they want conformity, like people to be pretty similar. Business, industry in the future, they like difference. They want people who are different and creative. So, but what we need to do is give them the opportunity to realise their potential. But you're absolutely right. It's a developmental difference. I keep saying that again. I'm changing those D's. If I can change those D's, then we could get people to think about the opportunities of and the creativities that people that are different have. Then I think the whole mindset towards supporting them would be different, and they would pick that up because they read the mood.
Yeah, mood. That's the key word there. Fintan, it's been a pleasure. Absolutely honoured to have you as my guest on this podcast, and we look forward to having you more in future for any podcasts that we'll be running as well. So
thank you very much for having me.
And thank you, listeners. And I'm not sure if we had any questions at all. On our platforms, that's fine, absolutely. So we'll be back for the next podcast in the near future.
That was